Hi, everybody. Your last sort of big assignment for the course, other than the final exam, is what's called the Individual Development and Identity Assignment. And this assignment is there not because it relates particularly well to U.S. history, but because it relates to a standard that this course has to cover for any elementary education majors who take this course. And that includes people who take this course and then decide maybe 10 years from now, oh, I want to be an elementary teacher. It also meets some of the standards for some of the requirements um, for the university as well in terms of developing citizenship at local, national, and global citizenship. So it meets multiple requirements that aren't really directly connected to history. And so the assignment instructions explain what you're going to do. This is largely a personal project. There aren't really right or wrong answers as long as you as long as you discuss what you're supposed to discuss. And then as part of it, I said that I would do a lecture on individual development and identity. And so, um, to be very forthright about this, I did have ChatGPT help me in preparing this lecture. This is something I've talked a little bit about in my in-person classes off and on because they also have to meet this standard for my in-person education classes, some of them. And I wanted something a little more cohesive than I have done, and so I've asked for some help from ChatGPT, um, and I think this is actually a pretty good presentation. Hopefully, you enjoy it and learn something from it. If you have taken psychology classes, particularly anything like a developmental psychology class, whatever it might be called at the university, I think that some of this is going to be very familiar to you, which is a good thing. And so, some of the key questions here is how is identity formed? How does it change? What shapes it? And then our sort of last thought is how is it connected to history? And the key figure here is Erik Erikson. And Erik Erikson was a developmental psychologist who proposed that human development occurs in a series of stages. And at every stage from infancy through old age, there is a fundamental problem or a fundamental question. And the answer, how that question is answered, determines identity development. Erickson's work is controversial. It has critics. Like most psychologists of his era, he was sort of mid 20th century, he tended to focus on white middle class guys. And that has been justly criticized. It also tends to put identity development is in very strict stages. This will happen at this age, this will happen at this age. And we know that development is much more complex than that. But Erickson's ideas, I think, still have a place for thought, at least. So, as I mentioned, there's a series of stages. We aren't going to talk about all of them. Um, we're just going to talk about a couple of the key ones for our purposes here. And identity development occurs. So the slide says through interaction with society, and that is true. But society also includes the family. But identity also is as well an individual aspect as well as a social aspect, and it does develop and change over time. And so the one stage where Erickson actually says the word identity is stage 5, which is adolescence or young adulthood. For most of you, this is roughly the stage at which you are or you have probably recently been in. And the idea here is that, as generally speaking, people may move out of their childhood home, they may get their first house, their first apartment, their first dorm room, whatever it might be. Um, the question increasingly becomes, who am I as a person? Who am I as a human being? And oftentimes, that is different than how you may have felt when you were 10 years old or 5 years old or 14 years old. It is beginning to understand and explain what your beliefs are, what your values are, and in some cases, those may be very similar or even identical as the beliefs and values you grew up with. And in other cases, they are going to vary. Um, and so, if a person enters this or exits this stage with a strong sense of their identity, a strong sense of self, of who they are as a person, that prepares them, Erickson claims, for success in the next stage. On the other hand, if they can't answer that question, who am I, by the end of this stage, they become sort of uncertain of their place in the world, uncertain of their identity. Now, because Erickson called this stage identity versus role confusion, this is why it shows up here as the identity stage. But identity develops before this stage as well. It develops throughout childhood. And over time, slowly, individuals increasingly start to question their parents' roles and beliefs and values. And at times, that questioning ends up reinforcing them. They say, you know what, I've questioned it and I agree with it. And at other times, it doesn't. I teach a lot of courses for people who want to become middle school teachers, and this is a key element of the middle school ages is young people ages around 10 to 14 becoming increasingly aware of who they are as a person outside of their role in the family. And this idea sort of maybe starts in, but it does continue into early adulthood, into early adulthood, which is what Erickson is talking about here. So for Erickson, identity could include things like a person's personality, their interests, and then very related, their values, their goals, their sense of purpose. Identity becomes sort of consolidated over time as people explore and as people then commit to things. So a person might explore different interests, right? Different hobbies. And if a particular hobby really resonates with you, that might become part of your identity. You might come to see yourself as X or Y or Z. Similarly, your sense of purpose might really become part of your identity. Your identity is as a blah, blah, blah. And that sense of purpose might be career related or it might not be. And then social aspects of identity development include things like interactions with our families, however you choose to define family, interaction with peers, your educational experiences, both in college but also in the K 12 world, are important aspects in how your identity has developed. If you have or have had mentors, that is an aspect of how your social identity develops. And then roles that you take on or participate in the community. That might be a role volunteering in church, in a community organization, volunteering at a school, volunteering, for a good cause, for a political cause, for something else. Um, those roles, if you engage in them, are part of the things that help to develop your social identity. And so here, this aspect of identity is really developed through relationships with others and interactions with others. Excuse me. Cultural identity is tied up, of course, with culture, and culture is an incredibly complicated idea. Um, these are all aspects that can be part of culture. So, ethnicity is often sort of mislabeled as culture. Um, and the ethnic component is certainly part of culture, but it's not the only part. And in some cases, people who share a common ethnicity might also have very different cultural identities. But that is part. The language that you speak, both the language perhaps what your original language was, or the language you speak at home, is part of your cultural identity. If you speak multiple languages, that is part of your cultural identity. Traditions that you have, that might be individual traditions, it might be traditions with family or with friends. Traditions tend to be culturally determined. So, as I'm recording this, right, it's the week of Thanksgiving in the United States. And Thanksgiving's history is tied up with lots of things historically, good things and bad things. Thanksgiving is not only an American holiday, it's also, for example, celebrated in Canada in October. And that is an example of a cultural tradition, but it's also an example of a cultural tradition that has varied over time. Thanksgiving only became a federal holiday in the United States during the Civil War, essentially, to try to bring the country together. And beyond that, more recently, we've seen sort of revisions to it. The idea, for example, of Friendsgiving, which is essentially a Thanksgiving meal, but shared with one's chosen family, one's closest friends. That is a variation on this, 100-plus-year-old tradition, but it's doing it in a different way. And this is what I mean, where this is a cultural thing that is part of sort of 21st century culture that would have seemed really odd in the 1950s, probably. And so part of culture too is a shared history, which is obviously one of the things we've talked about throughout this course. And one of the goals of the course has been to talk about not just the history of the United States as a nation, but also to look at the histories of cultural groups within the United States. And hopefully, we've done that as we've explored not just the European experience in the United States, but the experiences of Native Americans, of Black Americans, of Asian Americans, and of Hispanic Americans, both before and after they had that American appended to their name in many cases. And that leads us to civic and national identity. And what does it mean to be American? America is not really an ethnicity. Now, for some people, it is. On census forms, when people are asked to give their ethnicity, some people do mark American. That is particularly true in um, sort of the Ohio River Valley area, I believe. I've seen this on maps. It's been a while, but like Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, maybe Tennessee, like that region tends to have American as show up as the most common ethnicity on things like census forms. But American, you could argue that it's ethnicity if somebody's right, if somebody's parents and grandparents have been here and their family's been here for a very long time. Um, Even if their ancestry is European or African or Asian or Hispanic, that person might reasonably identify as American. I could think of that personally, and perhaps some of you can as well. Like, my last name Lund is a very Scandinavian name, and many of my ancestors came from Sweden. But if you look at my sort of ethnic background, it's not just Scandinavian, but it's also a lot of other things, mostly, not entirely, but almost entirely European. And um, for me to say, oh, my ancestry is Swedish is partially accurate, but it really isn't completely accurate. Um, it's I think I'm less than 50% Swedish. I think I'm maybe right around 50% all types of Scandinavian. And so it's complex. What does an American mean? And for a long time, the main idea of what an American was related to the idea of um, belief and support of the broad American culture. The idea of, I think your book talks about a little bit about the idea of the American dream, this idea of that, anyone can be successful. We judge people by their actions, by who they are, not by who their ancestors are, right? Martin Luther King Jr. famously said he looked forward for the day when people were judged by the content of their characters instead of the colors of their skin. Um, and so to be an American is really one argument. Interesting one is to support the idea of America. Other people disagree with that. We could talk about rights and responsibilities that come with citizenship. We could talk about various throughout history narratives of belonging. What does it mean to be an American versus not in American history? Issues with immigration are very controversial today in 2025. That is nothing new in American history. I think that we've seen that as we've gone through. So what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to belong? What does it mean if that is your identity or not? Um, and part of a national identity is symbols and shared stories, which can include myths. And a myth is essentially a story that a myth doesn't have to be false. A myth doesn't necessarily mean it's made up. It does mean it can't be proven. And in general, lots of myths are made up. So you may have heard at some point in your education the story of George Washington and the cherry tree, where George Washington said, George Washington cut down his father's or his stepfather's cherry tree with his little axe, and the guy said, "Who cut down my cherry tree?" And George Washington said, "I cannot tell a lie. I did it," to show how honest George Washington was. That almost certainly didn't happen. It was invented by one of Washington's biographers, Parson Weems. Decades after Washington died, like in the middle of the 1800s, is when we have the first occurrence of this story. It is a myth. It is a shared story. Um, where as I'm recording this on the shore of Lake, literally on the shore of Lake Bemidji, um, I think of the myth of Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox. That is very common in parts of Minnesota, but also in other states who also claim Paul Bunyan, Maine and Michigan and other places. That is a shared story. And we can think of symbols of national identity. We can think of symbols of the country, whether it be the flag, the Statue of Liberty, the Liberty Bell, Mount Rushmore. Um, you may think of a symbol as something else. Maybe it's the White House. Maybe it is the Arch in St. Louis. I don't know. Whatever you think it might be meaningful to you. And these symbols, of course, relate beyond national identity, and part of identity that isn't really talked about in this presentation in terms of personal identity is religious identity. And so we can think of symbols related to religion, whether it be the Christian cross or the Star of David with Judaism, the star and crescent moon in Islam, many different symbols for many different religions throughout the world. And that is also, of course, part of culture and part of identity. And so the next stage of Erickson I want to talk about is the sixth stage of his eight stages. And so the earlier stage we talked about identity versus role confusion. I mentioned that's sort of the stage of adolescence, going through the first years of college for a traditionally aged college student. And the immediate stage that follows that, stage six, is intimacy versus isolation. And this is um, essentially from your college years, so from early 20s through the start of middle age, which is sadly for Carl around age 40, according to Erickson. Um, and this is where you are now moving, you've established your identity, but now you are making connections with others. And the idea now that you have learned who you are, you've started to develop your beliefs and what you stand for, and your vision of you in the world. Now you're able to ideally make connections with others and find belonging. And this is a criticism of Erickson. He's like, wait, of course you have relationships and connections before you hit age 25. Um, Again, that's a criticism of Erickson. Erickson, I think, is arguing that this is particularly important at this stage. Like this is the key. Like this is often where people establish relationships, whether it be romantic relationships or simply deep friendships in other cases that last for the rest of their life. Um, and so the idea is that if you are successful in this stage that has been based on your identity development in stage five, that means you are going to find your place in the world as part of a broader community, as part of a broader group. On the other hand, if you sort of don't navigate this stage correctly, according to Erickson, you become isolated and you don't make those connections with others. Um, And so, essentially, um, and I don't. This is again. This is ChatGPT's summarization of Erickson, and I don't think it's entirely accurate, but I think it's accurate enough to be thought provoking for this lecture. So Erickson, as I mentioned, has 8 stages, and most of the stages occur in childhood. Um, the first half of them occur, according to Erickson, from birth to age 11. And so here, this is through much of these, you don't necessarily, according to Erickson, you don't necessarily have your own identity yet. Um, in early childhood, famously, infants and toddlers are egocentric. They think the world revolves around them. Literally, right? It's when you play peekaboo with a toddler or an infant, and right, you can't see. You think the child thinks if they can't see you, then you can't see them, and that is, I think, indicative of this idea that they don't yet have a firm sense of their identity in connection to others. And that's something that is being prepared for in childhood. As in the childhood stages, according to Erickson, if you navigate through them well, which involves as well a supportive, right, a supportive family and a supportive community, you are going to become industrious. You are going to be able to take initiative. You're going to have autonomy, and you're going to be generally trusting of people. You are preparing for your identity development that happens in adolescence from the teen years through the early years of college, or maybe all of the years of college, depending on. And so in adolescence, you're exploring identity. Again, this very famously starts in the middle school years. And then in young adulthood, and again, most of you who are viewing this video are kind of on the cusp between adolescence and young adulthood. And so Erickson would likely classify you in one of those two categories. Um, you're starting to develop a commitment to the identity that you've explored. And then adulthood, which is essentially the final 2 stages, is sort of refining your identity over time. There have been lots of identity movements in U.S. Historical context. One that we've talked about already in this lecture has been, I think, immigrant identity, um, and the balancing act between how much an immigrant group wants to assimilate into U.S. culture. That is controversial. At one point, assimilation was viewed as the norm and the ideal. And over the past few decades, increasingly people have started to question that, particularly, although not only on the left. Um, when I was in school, the common analogy for the U.S. was as a melting pot, where many different groups come together to make something new, to make something American. And that analogy is fallen out of favor on the academic left, especially. And I say the academic left because I still see it used often by politicians who are on the left, or by just individuals who lean left politically. Um, but a book in a textbook in sociology or in cultural geography that comes from a more leftist perspective is going to absolutely eviscerate the idea of the melting pot, and argues against it for various reasons, just to show the complexities of identity. Um, this is true for Black Americans' identities as well. This even involves names. Um, I tend to say Black American because one of my closest friends is a Black American, and if she is ever referred to as African American, she will go on about a 15-minute rant explaining why she is not. Um, that's important aspects of identity. Um, Again, the indigenous identity movement, Native American identity and sovereignty, which as a movement really flourished starting in the 1970s. At the same time, sexual identity movements started, and more recently, gender identity as well. So these types of identities have become, um, they're certainly often controversial in U.S. history, but they're also important in U.S. history. Globally, then, we talk a little bit about global citizenship. That's one of the goals of this course. Who you are, not just as a citizen of perhaps Minnesota or Wisconsin or wherever you're originally from, if you're from the U.S. originally, whatever state you're originally from, not just that local citizenship, but the fact that a majority of you are citizens of the United States and all of you are citizens of Earth. And so, what does global identity look like? And technology has linked the world far more than it's ever been linked before. That has both brought both positives and negatives. It leads to increasing global awareness, exposure to all sorts of cultural diversity, even at the same time, there tends to be a somewhat of a lessening of diversity um, as technology tends to reinforce dominant perspectives. And there's been for the past several decades this growing idea of global citizenship. So, some things to consider about as you think about your assignment. How has your identity changed over time? Who have been influences for you? What communities do you belong to? And so a community doesn't just mean like your hometown, right? You are part of a college community. Now you may or may not feel you belong to it. That varies from person to person, but that is part of your community. You may be part of a religious community. And that doesn't mean you live like just with other people. That doesn't mean like a town that is entirely Roman Catholic or entirely Lutheran or entirely Buddhist. It means, right, that you are part of a religious group and that's important to you through membership in a church or synagogue or temple or whatever. Um, so communities are really broad. It could be the community of, maybe you feel part of, I'm a part of the community of parents. Maybe you have an exceptionality and you believe you're part of the community related to that exceptionality. Maybe it's a hobby. Maybe you're a community of gamers or readers or bakers. And then where do you feel citizenship? Like, do you feel most connected to your city, to your state, to your nation? Do you feel most connected to the world? And then in terms of history, there used to be a dominant sort of idea in history and how history was taught of what's called the great person approach. And back in the day, it was called the great man approach, where we focused only on sort of the most important figures, which tended all to be male and tended to be white for the most part as well. Um, and there's still, I think, a little bit of value in that. Like, the U.S. would not be the U.S. if it were not for Lincoln, or for Jefferson, or for Washington, um, or for Rosa Parks, or for Martin Luther King, for lots of people. Um, Individuals are important. Individuals do shape history, but it's not just the important people. It's not just the great people. It's not just the people who you might see a building named after. All of us shape history in our own ways as well. And our identities are also sort of influenced by our cultures, and our cultures are influenced by history. We are all part of history. And so our personal narratives connect with historical narratives. Um, they are at times particularly important to us. Um, they have influence in different ways. For example, I grew up during the Cold War, and a lot of people who grew up in the Cold War will talk about being really heavily influenced by this pervasive fear of nuclear war and Armageddon. And I will say that that was never my experience. I think everyone knew about nuclear weapons. Everyone knew about the possibility of nuclear war, a possibility that still exists, of course. But it was not this existential crisis for me at any point in childhood or adolescence. Um, so when people would share that for me that was not my experience. That is not how a historical narrative connects to my personal narrative, but it is a way that historical narrative connects to other people's personal narratives. um, People often remember where they were when a particular historical event occurred. My father remembered where he was when he heard that World War II started. He was at home listening to the radio, and he was upset because it was preempting the show he wanted to watch. Um, I remember where I was when I heard about the attacks on September 11th. Um, I remember where I was when I heard in the 1980s that Reagan had been shot and there had been an assassination attempt. Um, you may or may not remember where you were when X or Y or Z happened, but and sometimes that's just a memory. Like the assassination attempt on Reagan, I don't think affected my personal identity, but it may have affected others. So we are all part of history. We are living in history. It is not separate from us. So this was a little bit longer than I anticipated. I hope you found it useful. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks for watching.